impossible for, well-funded, super capable person to know to be able to work out for themselves um, the knowledge that cultures take thousands of years to accumulate. And some of the best examples are, survival in Arctic environments. So there's a tremendous amount of incremental over the generations change and improvement and design to, for example, build a kayak and um, know how to prepare skins to make that kayak waterproof, to know how to use animal fiber, like gut threads, and how to fold the skins so that um, when you make loops, when you're sewing them, lashing those parts together, you will do it in such a way that the kayak is waterproof in ocean, which is, salty and going to be working through it. And it's the same for making waterproof boots. It doesn't matter how smart you are, you're not going to work out all of those technologies in a single lifetime. And this was shown, you know, repeatedly by the failures and successes of different Western Arctic explorers that either just tried to apply the technologies that they had versus appropriate the technologies and skills and practices that had culturally evolved locally for thousands of years. So Sir John Franklin and Roald Amundsen are two explorers who were trying to navigate um, a shipping passage through the Arctic from, sort of Prince William Sound, Canada, to to Greenland. And so, I mean, the funny thing is that climate change is now making this much easier for much longer through the year, and there are actually going to be times when we'll be able to um, run ships across the North Pole, even in you know in spring. Um, Sir John Franklin was, an English expedition. I think he had two ships. Roald Amundsen was almost 50 years later. John Franklin, 1845 to 6, sets out with two ships to explore the North Passage. Um, the ships were trapped in ice on King William Island. That was actually kind of expected. That should not have doomed the expedition, but all of the 128 crew dies. And then there were several expeditions to try to first rescue and then find the remains. There was a large reward that was put out, although they contested the eventual reward. Like I think a group found them in 1870, but the group didn't like discover them just by themselves. They asked the Inuit who lived nearby, who knew what had happened to the expedition, because they'd found the ship a few years later. Um, in contrast, Roald Amundsen, I think a Norwegian explorer, um, does the same, makes a similar journey in 1903, 1904. Their ship also runs aground, also trapped for 2 winters on King William Island. However, they learned hunting techniques. They used dog sleds, which they were taught how to use from um, nearby Netsilik people, and they survived because they were able to hunt enough food to live. And then when they were able to break the ship out when it melted, they completed the journey. And then they used the same skills to reach the South Pole 8 years later. right? So it was a successful expedition because they brought sleds and dogs with them to the South Pole, because that was an established, the appropriate technology for navigating in the Arctic, and then also in the Antarctic where there are no people living. Um, there are also many examples of isolation and things like disease or epidemics leading to losses of technology in Pacific Island populations. So this is especially um, in the most remote islands that aren't going to get visitors. Um, so one example is so that's in Pacific Island populations, but then in the Atlantic, there's a well-known example that the Inuit in Greenland um, had a much smaller toolkit, didn't have kayaks, bows and arrows, lysters, which is a little sort of three-prong sort of fishing tool, nor did they have the long tunnel igloos that were better at trapping heat. And it turns out, so in their culture, they bury tools with their elders. And it was a small population, and an epidemic in 1820 um, had killed off many of their elders. And the combination of just losing those people with that cultural knowledge and also physically losing some of the tools that were buried with them um, led to loss of really important technologies. Um, After 1853, immigration of different Inuit from Baffin Island restored some of those technologies. Interestingly, there might be something, I don't know if it was cultural or functional. The design, the shapes of the canoes that people were making ended up changing over 4 decades to become more like what the Greenland canoes used to look like and less like what the Baffin Island canoes looked like. So that's kind of interesting. It relates to that question, like if you were to redo evolution a second time, would you end up with the same products? In some cases, yes. In some cases, probably no. Um, so um, the benefits of cultural evolution are going to be are going to depend on how variable the environment is. I mean, so there's a few things. So benefits of cultural evolution, some of it has nothing to do with variability. Some of it just has to do with the fact that culture can accumulate knowledge that is impossible to work out for yourself within a single lifetime. So that's one really important take home. Um, but then one of the inherent questions about human evolution is why did we only have um, sort of city states level agriculture leading to city states leading to sort of rapid evolution of civilizations, and then modernity really only in the last 10,000 years, even though anatomically modern humans have been around for definitely more than 100,000 years. And one hypothesis is that um, the environment was too variable. The cycles of ice ages and other climatic change um, was too great for accumulated cultural knowledge to build. In other words, people often build settlements at the boundary between land and water because it's water provides tremendous resources and also transportation, but that means that you're vulnerable to flooding, inundation, sort of tsunamis, hurricanes, things like that, that can wipe out local settlements. And so when the environment was changing a little too rapidly, that may have prevented the longer term settlements that then led to sort of cultural evolution kind of taking off. And that the last 10,000 years has been an especially stable climate period. So that's what this graph is showing, and um, I'll just emphasize that the last 10,000 years have been favoring rise of city-states and civilization. Now, and then, I mean, interestingly, it's been argued that the climatic stability that we've experienced over the last 10,000 years or so might in fact be due to environmental changes that humans brought about through modification of landscape and sort of forest clearing in cities and sort of population growth. And that's a little bit beyond the scope of this course. But it's kind of interesting. The main take on that I want us to have here is that you need a certain amount of stability in order for cultural learning to be especially sort of valuable. In other words, the if what cultural evolution gives you or cultural transmission gives you is what's worked the last couple thousand years, it had better that had better be a good signal. And if your climate is changing every couple thousand years, then those culturally passed on traits might not be as helpful. Or if the climate is changing every 500 years. Um, okay. So that's what I just kind of said. Um, if conditions change only over thousands of generations, then maybe you don't need social learning. You can have genetically evolved food preferences, right? If food preferences are going to be the foods that are available are the same over 50,000 years, um, then a genetic food preference is good enough. If conditions change every generation, you don't need social learning because what worked for your grandparents isn't going to work for you. However, if conditions change over tens to 100 generations, then social learning is critical. Something that's worked well after being tested for a couple hundred years is something that you'd never be able to work out for yourself, but it's really valuable to know. Um, One of the interesting things is what to do about sort of behaviors or culturally transmitted traits that are maladaptive. So one of the things that's like an important take home in 106 is the idea that some of the strongest arguments for evolution are not examples of exquisite adaptation, right? Because sort of perfect fit between traits in the environment are equally consistent with them having been shaped by natural selection for that function or having been designed for a particular function. So I'm always emphasizing when I'm teaching 106 that it's the vestigial traits, the traits that only make sense as a result of descent with modification, but don't actually serve a function, like the useless remnant tiny mini leg bones in whales, or some would argue the appendix, although maybe it still serves a bit of a function. Um, that maladaptive vestigial traits are some of the strongest arguments in favor of evolution. Similarly, maladaptive behaviors show how much our behaviors are driven by culturally transmitted values rather than genetic evolution. And you could make an argument that almost all of our behaviors in modernity are genetically maladaptive. In other words, very little of what we do day to day and year to year is designed to increase our lifetime reproductive success, right? And there are some exceptions. There are some supernatalist small populations. But by and large, most people have far fewer offspring than they could, produce throughout their lives, and more importantly, don't make decisions day to day that or behave day to day in ways that are going to sort of maximize genetic fitness, lifetime reproductive success. Um, and that shows how powerful culture is in shaping behavior. Um, and so there are alternative explanations for maladaptation. And when I say maladaptation, I'm not saying good or bad. I'm not even saying, you know, um, like good for like the long-term survival or bad for the long-term survival of the human race. What I say is maladaptation, I mean, in this case, traits that don't maximize lifetime reproductive success. So Dawkins and the evolutionary psychologists Cosmides and Tooby think that all of these traits that aren't maximizing lifetime reproductive success are reflections of a big mistake. The idea that at one point, all of our behaviors were adaptive when we lived in small groups of close relatives, and now that we no longer live in small groups of close relatives, and the technology and the environment has completely changed, these traits are all a big mistake, like diabetes. So the diabetes trait is that genes that help you survive small periods of starvation in an environment with plentiful access to food and lack of exercise are now maladaptive and causing disease. Richardson and Boyd, in the chapter we read for today, chapter 6, argue that they're rather than sort of a big mistake that our cultural transmission reflects a trade-off. In other words, we have to have certain learning rules to be able to change behaviors rapidly on the scale of a couple generations, much faster than genes can evolve. And the trade-off for being able to change behaviors super rapidly is that our conformist bias, prestige bias, and as we're going to talk about next week, punishment and enforcement stabilizes maladaptive as well as adaptive traits. So the idea of Richardson and Boyd is that it's not that all of our traits used to be perfectly adapted more than 200 years ago, and now they're screwing us over. But even then, there was a trade-off that sometimes screwy traits were being fixed culturally in populations, but the trade-off was that our ability to be so easily swayed by others around us and our culture allowed us to change behaviors rapidly and develop new technologies, and colonize new habitats and thrive um, despite the trade-offs tens of thousands of years ago. Okay, so it's a little bit different. Cosmides and Tooby and Dawkins are saying that like all of our behaviors now that don't maximize lifetime reproductive success are, used to be totally adaptive genetic predispositions, and now they're bad genetic predispositions. Richardson and Boyd are saying that the only important genetic predisposition is the way we learn culturally. And that led to some crappy behaviors, but survival a long time ago. And there was a trade-off the whole way through. Um, so, as always, just what I just said is now in word form. For cultural evolution to allow rapid colonization of diverse habitats, the learning rules have to be general and fast. Things like copy what everyone else is doing, see what the most successful one is doing, and do that. Um, so the speed of cultural evolution depends on these biases, and allow for traits to evolve really rapidly. Traits like being able to take manioc leaves and pound them for 2 days and soak the combination of pounding them and soaking them and cooking them for 2 days so that you can get rid of the toxins and get the benefit of the food value. Um, the other, incredibly important take home is that cultural evolution makes group level selection possible in a way that it's not for any other species that do not rely on on cultural evolution to shape behaviors. So the what features are needed for group selection? It's the same features that are needed for natural selection on individuals, but one level up. In other words, for natural selection, you need variation. Whoops, got to turn it into a pen. You need variation. So for group selection, it has to be among groups. And that variation has to be heritable. And that heritability can be cultural, doesn't have to be genetic. And there has to be overproduction and or struggle for existence, and the variation must affect fitness. And so in this case, success or survival of groups. Okay, so what is it about cultural evolution that makes group selection possible? So if you remember, um, the reason why group selection is less powerful in animals that depend on that mostly have genetic control of traits is that the presence through immigration, through gene flow or mutation of a selfish individual um, always corrodes altruistic behavior from within, right? So groups are vulnerable to mutation or immigration of genotypes that don't cooperate. cultural evolution enforces and leads to greater difference among groups. In other words, let's see. Okay, I just want to catch up to the slides. So you need variation among groups. You need variation that's tied to fitness that affects group success, and you need heritability. So cultural evolution, cultural transmission ensures both of these. Um, that groups stay very different from each other and pass on their traits to the next generation, because if if your behaviors are not shaped by genes but are shaped by what do you see other people doing around you and what do you see the most successful individuals doing in the group, then it doesn't matter if you come from a group where everyone behaves selfishly. If you enter a new group and everyone is behaving differently, you will take on the behaviors of those groups, of that group. Okay, so again, I keep getting ahead of the slides. Why is group level selection rare in most animals? That's because altruists within groups are always vulnerable to selfish individuals. And those selfish individuals could get there um, arriving by migration or mutation, right? So selfish traits arising through gene flow or mutation. Um, However, um, enforcement of social norms within groups combined with our biases towards conformity and imitating successful individuals enforces behavior within groups. Um, so we're going to talk about moralistic punishment even more next week. We're going to talk about humans' willingness to punish others, um, and um, and that is what makes sort of group selection more possible in humans or any species that depends on cultural transmission and also enforcement of social norms than in groups that don't depend on those, in groups that just depend on genes to control behaviors. So you still need group selection in two ways. One is to balance out the small cost of punishment, which itself is an altruistic behavior, and also to make sure that what that the cultural norms that are being enforced are not just completely arbitrary. In other words, there has to be some competition among groups. Otherwise, each group is free to enforce whatever goofy behaviors um, it it has arrived at on individuals, and the fact that some of them are very harmful will never lead to that group failing in competition with other groups. Um, so we talked about before, group selection can be done in by too little or too much migration. If there's no migration, then actually, if there's no migration over time, each group will eventually will go extinct. Um, but the other take home in this context is that if there's too little migration, selfishness within each group will eventually completely win. The groups that are producing more individuals because individuals within the groups are behaving altruistically, and so the group is more successful, have to be able to spread those individuals out. However, if there's too much migration, then the altruists are always having to help migrants who may or may not, who may be coming from groups that don't have the same altruistic behavior. In other words, groups have to stay different from each other in behavior, so that they have very different fitnesses among groups, and also so that in some groups, altruists are just helping each other, and in other groups, selfish individuals are harming each other more than being able to parasitize altruists. So what we've learned about culturally evolved traits is that they maintain variation among groups without genes. From the song dialect studies, what we learned about song dialects is their function appears to be to basically allow individuals to fit in, especially with their neighbors, matching local variants. Immigrants produce the locally appropriate song. So what happens in birds is when an individual from one population, one dialect population, emigrates and enters another dialect population, it's not like now there's a new song that's potentially competing with the other types. They match what's locally appropriate, and that happens in human um, populations and cultures as well. So immigrants usually take on the character of either the majority, what most people do in this place, or the most successful in this new place. And those are because of what we talked about already, conformist bias and prestige bias, and then what we talked a little bit about last week, enforcement of social norms. So I talked about it in animal context last week, like honeybee workers eating or removing the eggs that might be the male eggs laid by other workers, so that as a group they have the highest success, and they're mostly rearing the eggs that are laid by the queen. That's an enforcement of social norms. But we're going to talk about next week moralistic punishment and enforcement of social norms in humans. But basically, you for now, I can say you can take my word for it that human cultures enforce conformity in a number of ways, right? We do it with prestige, we do it with gossip, we do it with police and jailing, we do it with, we used to do it with ostracism, um, and different human societies share um, the ability to enforce social norms. Okay, so cultural evolution maintains variation among groups, keeps them very different. Um, so the the main difference between humans and non-human animals is in our degree of social learning, and the role that culture places in shaping behaviors. And the Richardson and Boyd argument, which I probably agree with, is that dependence on social learning and cultural transmission makes um, group selection more important for humans, made it more important in our past than it usually is in animal populations, where we see it occasionally, but it's not the sort of dominant force shaping behavior. Animals mostly cooperate with close relatives in very small groups, and humans don't. Um, and the interesting gene culture coevolution thing that's going on is once you have um, enforcement of social norms, punishment of individuals that are acting selfishly within groups, you then create a selective environment where individuals that are genetically predisposed to altruism may have higher reproductive success. In other words, if they're behaving in a way that allows them to have children and fit in with the group and not get ostracized and shunned by their community, then those genetic traits will be favored, right? So this whole thing is trying to explain why humans are irrational in a sort of fitness maximizing sense. Um, so um, enforcement of social norms favors genetic altruism. In other words, if groups enforce behavior through punishment, um, that can reduce the genetic advantage of selfish behavior, the genetic fitness of selfish individuals. And so that's what Richardson and Boyd are arguing. Um, and it doesn't mean that humans are never selfish. We are selfish often, um, in many contexts, with our loved ones, within our families, within our communities. There's always a fraction of people who are not paying taxes. Um, and everyone is balancing sort of selfishness and pro-social behavior, but we are much more pro-social with large numbers of strangers and non-relatives than any other animal. Okay, so this leads to a bunch of sort of empirical questions to try to support this hypothesis that group level selection was really important in shaping even genetic predispositions to behavior in humans. So one question is, how strong was group selection in the past? What was the mortality rate of groups in the past? How important was competition among groups, through warfare, um, or other means? Um, how important is moralistic punishment in pre-industrial societies? Does it affect, behavior? Does it affect reproductive success and fitness? How effective is punishment? Do we have a genetic predisposition? How willing are people to punish? And is that something that's shared among enough cultures to be considered, part of human nature? Altruistic punishment. So I'm just going to barely start this now, and then that's what we're mostly going to be talking about next week. But I'm going to mention some archaeological evidence because that came up in chapter 6. Um, Richardson and Boyd cite one study that was trying to integrate and review the extinction rates of pre-industrial groups. And, these are different studies, mostly, of living pre-industrial groups in the 20th century. Um, and so these would be studies that would be carried out over decades. And, in these studies, there might be 14 groups with 5 social extinctions over a period of 50 years. So the percent extinction rate per generation was 17.9% in the May-Enga. And then what the take home of this table is that actually the at least social extinction, so not everyone dies when a group ceases to exist because some are taken prisoner or emigrate and are adopted into new groups, but because of cultural evolution, they take on the practices of their groups. So even though it's not complete genetic extinction, it is social extinction, a group ceasing to exist, even though many of its members now live within another group or groups. But these extinction rates are pretty darn high, right? And so it suggests that group level competition is a powerful selective force. And it's an interesting question whether present day nations are more stable. We sort of think so because we're terrible at assessing variability. But, the Soviet Union fell in my lifetime. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I should figure it out. There are 20 different countries, maybe 30 new countries in my lifetime. Um, Only a third of them are former Soviet republics. Um, and so it's an interesting question whether our societies are more stable. I think they are, um, but it's a good question. Um, so this was a fascinating study. This is by Samuel Bowles in Science in 2009. And he was integrating a bunch of studies and trying to estimate. So the previous slide, the table from Richardson and Boyd, is was studies of extant living pre-industrial groups. Um, however, modern pre-industrial societies kind of hemmed in, forced onto suboptimal habitat by, you know, modern empires and industrial societies may not reflect Pleistocene patterns. So, and that was an argument that's been made that it's possible that these are people that have been forced onto marginal lands, and so they might have higher group level extinction than, you know, in than 50,000 years ago. And so what Bowles was doing was looking at archaeological remains, which is really hard, right? Because you know, there's like 100 bones in the human body plus a lot of little tiny hand ones. And you know, if you have most of them, you can do a great job of inferring whether they met a violent death. Also, you can do demographic analyses, like when a bunch of fighting age males are buried all at the same time, that reflects a recent battle, right? And then there are um, arrow and spear wounds. If it hits bone, you actually can often detect um, that kind of injury. But there was a study done, and I think it was like only 20% of deadly arrow strikes led to strikes on bone that could be recognized or determined, right? So there's huge challenges with assessing mortality. But this Bowles study from 2009 was trying to measure that. And it was estimating both the fraction of mortality due to warfare and high proportions of mortality that seem to be associated with warfare, um, and that those high levels of mortality means that intergroup competition can favor even quite costly altruistic traits. So they also did a mathematical model, and depending on, so the mortality during warfare is this lambda. So lambda equals mortality during warfare. And if the mortality during warfare is higher, then even costly traits, especially if you're living in a very small group, even very costly altruistic traits, like a trait where you have one less out of 8 children, um, but that leads to greater success in warfare, will be favored, right? If the mortality in warfare due to warfare is low, 0.045 in the Nbara population, then only, you know, less costly traits might be favored. Um, however, you know, costly traits that cost you 13% of your reproductive success being favored because of really high mortality rates due to battle, that that can lead to um, you know, extreme selection for helpful altruistic behavior. Okay, so if I can, you know, summarize Richardson and Boyd's main argument, it would be this. The first thing that we've learned that Dawkins argues over and over again is that cooperation in non-human animals is mostly among close relatives in small groups. And so things like reciprocity, the examples are usually among like pairs or a few vampire bats. Humans cooperate with non-relatives in large groups, strangers all the time, right? And so Dawkins argues that that's the big mistake. Big mistake is that traits that used to be adaptive when directed towards relatives through most of our evolutionary history no longer are. Richardson and Boyd and Henrik and others argue something different. What they argue is that what makes humans different is not that we used to only help relatives and now we're idiots in modern society, which in some ways is true. Like diabetes is an example of a trait that our bodies are not able to deal with the access to food and lack of exercise that we have. But Richardson and Boyd and Henrik argue that I'll call it unique human reliance on social learning and cultural evolution make group selection plausible, right? So why is that? Because cultural evolution, and that's the way it works in humans with conformist and prestige bias, and what we're going to talk about next week, which is enforcement of social norms, keeps groups variable, different from each other, and less vulnerable to selfish individuals. And so both of those things, not being invasible by a selfish trait and just being very different from other groups, meaning that there'll be big differences in the average reproductive success, the fitness of different groups. So cultural evolution makes group selection plausible. And then the last thing is socially enforcing groups create an environment that favors genetic evolution of altruism, or at least the desire to get along, pro-social, right? And so this is the gene culture co-evolution of traits that don't maximize individual fitness. Okay, so that's, in one slide, that's the main argument of the course, right? That's kind of summarizes all of Richardson and Boyd and Henrik. So I think I'll stop there. And like I said, next week is mostly going to be about enforcement of social norms in human cultures, which is kind of fun. Okay, any questions? Okay, I will, yeah. So I'm going to stop sharing this. I'll stick around for a second.